You know that feeling. You land somewhere totally new, maybe a different country or even just a different city, and at first everything feels, well, just a bit strange, unfamiliar.
Yeah, like you're constantly trying to figure things out. New streets, new rules,
Hmm.
maybe even a whole new language.
Exactly. And then maybe after a while, something clicks. You start to feel, okay, this could be my place. Or sometimes the complete opposite happens.
Oh, like when you go back home.
Right. You go back to where you grew up, your home country, and suddenly that feels off. Like the person you became while you were away doesn't quite slot back in.
hmm It's a really common feeling. Have you ever felt like that, like home isn't just one fixed spot on the map?
Or like you kind of belong everywhere and nowhere at the same time. That's really what we're digging into today.
That whole search for belonging, it's such a basic human thing, isn't it? But it gets so complicated when your life stretches across different cultures, when you're trying to navigate between these different worlds.
Absolutely. And that intricate, sometimes confusing sense of belonging, especially in immigrant life and shaping your cultural identity, that's our focus.
Yeah, we've gathered some really interesting stuff for you. We've got research from places looking at policy and how people adapt,
Acculturation studies and things like that.
right? But then we've also got these incredibly personal stories, things people have shared online or in interviews, really raw human experiences.
It's that mix, isn't it? The sort of academic view alongside the really deeply personal.
Exactly. And we want to unpack all of this with you. Try to understand what these different perspectives tell us about figuring out your identity, finding your place when your roots are maybe in one country, but your life is happening somewhere else entirely.
Okay, so let's jump in. First off, maybe we should try to clarify what we even mean by belonging here, and how does that traditional idea of assimilation fit in? Or maybe it doesn't fit so well anymore.
Well, like you said at the start, a really strong feeling that comes through, especially in the personal accounts, is how complicated home becomes after you've lived somewhere else.
Right. It's really common, apparently, to feel more at home in the new place sometimes than back in your country of origin.
Yeah, people describe it online using phrases like feeling in orbit with no landing pad. That really paints a picture, doesn't it?
It does, or that feeling of belonging everywhere and nowhere. It's not just theory, it's how people actually feel.
Totally. And for a long time, the way societies, particularly places like the U.S., talked about immigrants fitting in was all centered around this idea of assimilation.
Hmm.
And some of the research we looked at argues that even though some people say it's an outdated idea, assimilation is still very much seen as a national goal, or at least an expectation.
Okay, so what did that traditional assimilation ideal actually look like based on the sources? What were people sort of expected to do?
Well, one perspective, mentioned in the Brookings material we read, kind of lays out an unspoken deal almost. It often boiled down to about three main things.
Only three. That sounds, well, it sounds a bit too neat already. What are they?
Okay, so first, immigrants were expected to accept English as the main language.
Right.
Pretty straightforward, right?
Okay, language. Got it.
Second, they were supposed to live by what gets called the Protestant work ethic. The whole idea of being self-reliant, working hard, being morally upright, that sort of thing.
Language, work ethic.
Okay.
And the third,
Taking pride in being American, believing in American values, democracy, equality, all that. So the idea was if you did those three things, you were considered successfully assimilated by the majority of society.
it sounds so simple when you list it like that. Learn English, work hard, be patriotic, and boom, you belong.
Yeah, but the sources immediately show that picture just doesn't capture the reality at all. It's way more complex.
How so?
Well, a really key point is that assimilation isn't just one smooth path to a final destination. It's described as multidimensional,
Meaning?
meaning it involves lots of different parts of life, getting a job, making social connections, maybe cultural habits changing, getting involved politically, and crucially, these things don't all happen at the same pace.
We're even in the same direction, I guess.
Exactly. And the sources also make this really interesting point. It's not irreversible.
Ah, okay. So it's not like you flick a switch and you're assimilated forever.
Precisely. People's connection can shift. Someone might feel less tied to the new culture or language later on, as one source notes. It's fluid.
Okay, so if that simple three-part checklist doesn't really work, let's get into the messy reality. How do these complexities actually play out for people living between cultures, trying to integrate and feel like they belong? What's the lived experience like?
Well, if we take that first point, language,
Hmm.
It's so much more than just learning English to get by. There's a huge emotional side to it.
Yeah, the sources mention people often stay really attached to their native language, even if they become totally fluent in the new one.
Right. And sometimes that sparks this drive to reconnect with a heritage that feels like it's slipping away. There was a striking example in one piece
Which one?
about a young Mexican-American guy who didn't actually grow up speaking Spanish himself,
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
but he felt it was really important that his kids would learn it.
That says so much. Or think about politicians with Latino backgrounds making a real effort to learn Spanish later in life.
To connect with their communities.
Yeah.
And then there's the story of Selena, the Tejano singer. She grew up speaking English in Texas.
Right. She had to learn Spanish specifically for her music career.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It just flips that whole traditional idea on its head. Language isn't just about fitting in. It's identity, connection, even your job sometimes.
It's so powerful. And the sources also point out some, well, unexpected things that can happen with language acquisition.
Yeah, this was fascinating. Some research found that while newly arrived, Latino students might struggle initially with English in school. Sometimes, those born in the U.S. who were fluent in English actually ended up adopting what researchers called an anti-achievement ethic,
Meaning?
meaning they blended into a kind of youth culture that didn't really value doing well in school. Like one teacher said, as the Latino students become more American, they lose interest in their schoolwork. They become like the others.
Wow, that's really counterintuitive. It challenges that whole assumption that just becoming like the others is always the goal or always positive.
Totally. It shows assimilation isn't always straightforward.
Okay, so that's language. What about the work ethic part, the economic side of things?
Here, too, the research shows it's a mixed bag. Some immigrant groups, Japanese, Korean, Chinese immigrants are mentioned, tend to reach similar wage levels to native-born workers over time.
Okay, so some groups integrate economically quite well.
Yes. But for others, like Mexican immigrants mentioned in the sources, there's often a persistent wage gap, even when you compare people with similar education levels.
And why is that, do the sources say?
Well, they suggest it's complicated. It could be differences in education quality, maybe legal status issues. Discrimination definitely plays a role.
Mm-hmm.
But they even bring up the possibility of cultural differences in attitudes toward work, which loops back to that traditional work ethic idea, but maybe in a way that disadvantages some groups.
Right. It just shows how hard it is to pin down exactly why economic outcomes differ so much. Success isn't guaranteed or uniform.
Not at all.
Okay, now let's get into identity and that really deep-seated desire just to fit in. This is where those personal stories really hit, I think.
They really do. One source reminds us that forming new group identities is actually part of the historical process in the U.S. People came from different villages in Italy or Poland.
Then became Italians or Poles here.
Right, and then Italian Americans or Polish Americans. It's a process.
And you see similar things happening today with labels like Hispanic or Latino.
Exactly. Though historically, the wider society has often felt a bit uneasy about those hyphenated identities, kind of failing to see them as part of how assimilation actually happens.
But the sources also talk about a different kind of challenge to fitting in, especially if you, well, if you look different from the majority.
Yeah, the French Girl source had some really powerful examples of this, like the American woman living in Korea. She learned the language, understood the culture, but she always stood out physically.
And people treated her differently because of it.
Sometimes like a spectacle, yeah.
Right.
Even taking photos of her secretly.
Mm-hmm.
Or the person in Spain who spoke fluent Spanish but felt they could never truly pass as Spanish just because of how they looked.
That must be exhausting, that feeling of always being the outsider, the foreigner, even when you've ticked all the boxes on paper.
It seems especially tough in countries that are very ethnically homogenous.
Mm-hmm.
Physical appearance becomes a really high bar for feeling truly included.
Yeah.
That source even mentioned the Korean term gyopo. It's used to distinguish ethnic Koreans who were born and grew up abroad from those born and raised in Korea. It shows that even having the same ethnic background doesn't automatically mean you belong or are seen as the same.
Wow. It really drives home that belonging isn't just about what you do, is it? It's also so much about how other people see you and accept you.
And this connects directly to the emotional side, the stress of it all, which came up in the research on immigrant teenagers, that Diva Portal source we looked at.
About Somali youth in Sweden.
Yes, it talked about this deep longing for a sense of belonging among them.
And they faced real challenges, right? Like discrimination.
Definitely. There were examples of teachers just assuming they weren't capable academically, even when their test scores were good. just based on prejudice.
That's awful.
And language barriers, feeling excluded socially, it all adds up. The research was clear.
Hmm.
Feeling discriminated against, especially if you're visibly different, really affects mental health and whether you feel like you belong, especially at school.
There's also that other feeling, the disorientation that came up in some of the online discussions and psychology articles related to the end of history illusion.
Ah, yes. That's the idea that we tend to think the person we are right now is pretty much the finished product.
And that our life circumstances won't change that much either.
Right. So when you live abroad for a significant time, you suddenly realize, wow, I've changed a lot. And maybe your home country has changed too while you're gone.
Yeah, people online were talking about going back home after years away and just not recognizing it anymore, or feeling like they didn't fit in with old friends or family in the same way.
It makes going home feel almost like visiting a foreign place sometimes.
So, with all this struggle to integrate and find your place, it leads to this really personal question that people were debating online. When you live abroad, do you try really hard to blend in, to sort of pass?
Or do you just embrace the fact that you're different, that you're a kind of blend of cultures?
And the realization some people came to was that maybe trying to be the perfect foreigner, someone who fits in seamlessly, is just impossible and maybe not even necessary.
Yeah, maybe it's about accepting that mixed identity, recognizing that living between worlds has changed you, and that's actually okay. Maybe even valuable.
Okay, so we've talked about the personal side, the feelings, the challenges, but now let's shift to something really surprising that came out of the research. This idea that assimilation, the process of integrating, instead of just leading to peace and harmony, can actually create new problems, new conflicts.
Yeah, this was one of the most counterintuitive things in the Brookings material. It really pushes back against the simple idea that just bringing groups closer together automatically makes things better.
You'd think less separation would mean less friction.
Right. That's the common sense view. But some research, like work by sociologist Susan Olzak that was cited, suggests conflict can actually spike precisely when the boundaries between groups start to weaken.
How does that work?
Well, when different groups start interacting more closely, competing for the same jobs, maybe moving into the same neighborhoods, that increased contact, paradoxically, can lead to more tension, especially as one group starts to advance and maybe feels like it's threatening the established order or competing for scarce resources.
So integration itself, the very process of groups becoming less separate, can stir up conflict. That feels like a really crucial point that often gets overlooked.
It really does. The source gave examples from history, like the discrimination Jewish immigrants faced as they became more economically successful, and more contemporary examples like Latinos potentially facing more social discrimination claims as they make economic gains. It suggests progress isn't always smooth sailing.
And the sources argue that in the U.S. context, specifically, things like civil rights laws and affirmative action, while intended to help, might have inadvertently changed how this friction plays out.
Yes, the argument presented is that by creating pathways to address group-based issues, these systems can sometimes incentivize groups to frame their struggles primarily as racial minority grievances. This can turn the normal bumps and conflicts of assimilation into more formalized, potentially divisive group conflicts.
It seems like there's this tendency, maybe on both sides of the immigration debate, to ignore this connection between assimilation and conflict. The source called it American obtuseness.
Yeah, like people either focus only on the conflict and ignore the integration that might be happening, or they only focus on the success stories and ignore the friction that the process itself can generate.
But the point is, they're often linked.
The material suggests they often are, at least for a period. Assimilation and conflict can go hand in hand.
The source also mentioned how quickly discussions about immigration in the U.S. get framed purely in terms of racism.
Mhm. And while acknowledging that racism is absolutely real and a major factor, the source suggested that always framing it that way can sometimes shut down more nuanced conversations about other kinds of competition or conflict that might be happening between groups, whatever their race.
It's just a lot of layers.
It really is. Multiple things are usually going on at once.
How does this picture compare to what the sources said about Europe? I think the Zocalo Public Square piece touched on this.
Yeah, that piece pointed out that in Europe, the big debate often seems less about how many immigrants and more about how to integrate the ones who are already there.
But similar underlying issues.
Kind of. Like in the U.S., European countries often find they need foreign workers. But at the same time, Voters get really anxious about cultural differences,
Mm.
which can lead to political gridlock.
And there were specific mentions about concerns around Muslim populations, right? And fears about fundamentalism.
Yes, those concerns were noted as part of the European context. And while historically the U.S. might have had more success with integration than Europe, that Zocalo source sounded a bit of a warning
What was the warning?
that the U.S. might be creating future problems now, partly because of the huge number of undocumented immigrants who are basically shut out from fully participating in society.
Right, that creates a whole separate set of issues.
Exactly. And also the really angry anti-immigrant rhetoric could be breeding alienation, especially among the younger generations growing up hearing that.
So it sounds like lots of countries are wrestling with similar anxieties about cultural change and integration, even if the specifics are different.
Definitely. With people moving around the globe so much, more and more countries are dealing with these questions. How do people from different backgrounds find their place? And how do societies adjust?
Okay, so given all these challenges, the personal struggle, the potential for conflict, the fact that it's way more complex than just following a checklist, what do the sources suggest about finding a way forward? How can we actually foster belonging for individuals, but also in communities?
Well, one thing that comes through consistently, both in the research and the personal stories, is that belonging is seen as a journey. It's
Mm.
not a quick fix, not a destination you just arrive at.
It takes time.
It definitely takes time, as one source put it. There's no magic wand.
That people can do things, right. The My Dolce Casa source talked about individuals being proactive.
Yeah, things like actively getting involved in local stuff, community events, being curious, open-minded, making an effort to actually build relationships with local people. Little things can add up.
And then there are more structured ways to help, right? Like those My Grateful Cookery classes you mentioned earlier.
Yes, that was such a great example.
Tell us a bit more about how that worked. Cooking classes helping integration.
So the setup is that migrant chefs, often people who are vulnerable in some way, teach cooking classes to people from the host community. They share recipes from their home countries.
Okay.
And the research found these classes were really effective at reducing prejudice and building positive feelings between the groups.
Why did they work so well? What was the thinking?
It really lined up with this classic idea in social psychology called contact theory from Gordon Allport. The theory says that positive contact between different groups can reduce prejudice, but only if certain conditions are met.
What kind of conditions?
Things like having common goals in this case, everyone working together to cook the meal, having intergroup cooperation where people have to collaborate, not compete.
Makes sense. Everyone chopping vegetables together for the same pot.
Exactly. And having the support of authorities, which here means the organization, My Grateful, creating a welcoming, structured environment with facilitators. All these elements were present in the cooking classes.
So the shared task, the cooking itself, kind of naturally breaks down barriers?
It seems so. People are working together, sharing skills, focused on creating something delicious. It builds connection.
And the sources also mention storytelling being important in those settings.
Hugely important. Sharing stories, even small ones about the food or culture, can create empathy. It opens, as one source said, a window into a new culture.
But it has to be done carefully, right?
Absolutely. The key was empowering the chefs to share what they felt comfortable sharing on their own terms, not pressuring them to recount trauma or get overly personal just because the participants might be curious. Respecting privacy was crucial.
So it's about inviting connection, not demanding vulnerability. Maybe talking about the food itself is a good starting point. The history of a dish, what it means back home.
Exactly. Food is such a universal thing. It's a great way to start conversations and build bridges naturally.
It sounds like the ideal situation, kind of hinted at in one of the sources, is this sense of mutual exchange.
Yeah, where immigrants gain something valuable, maybe safety, opportunity, new ideas, but the host country also gains something valuable from the immigrants. New perspectives, different ways of seeing things, maybe even a fresh look at their own culture.
And finally, that research on the Somali youth reminded us just how critical social support is.
Definitely. Community programs, support networks, these are vital for helping immigrant young people cope with stress and build resilience. They can't do it all alone.
So it really is a combination of things. Individual effort, creating opportunities for positive interaction like those classes, encouraging empathetic storytelling, and having strong community support systems, all part of that long journey. You know, exploring all this material really brings home just how incredibly complex that feeling of belonging is, especially when you've lived across different cultures.
Yeah, it's definitely not about just tossing out your old identity and putting on a new one based on, learning the language or getting a certain type of job.
No. It feels much more like a constant negotiation, doesn't it? Between who you feel you are inside, your history, your heritage, and then all the expectations and the realities of the society you're living in now.
And like we saw, that negotiation isn't always smooth. It can create friction, even while people are successfully integrating in other ways.
That feeling that so many people in the sources described, you learn so much, you feel connections in new places, you gain so much, but maybe you never feel that perfect 100% sense of belonging in the old-fashioned way.
That feeling of belonging everywhere and nowhere.
Right. It seems like that's actually a really common and maybe even valid experience for a lot of people.
And perhaps,
Mm.
perhaps there's actually a kind of strength in that, in being that blend, rather than seeing it as something incomplete.
That's a really interesting thought. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? When you think about how assimilation, according to these sources, can actually generate conflict, even as it helps people integrate.
And how belonging is such a personal, winding path.
What does that really mean for how we as societies should think about immigration and integration?
Is the ultimate goal really that traditional idea of full assimilation, where everyone becomes the same? Or is there maybe a different kind of outcome, perhaps messier, but maybe richer and more realistic,
Mhm.
that happens when cultures meet and mix, even with all the imperfections?
Yeah, definitely something to think about.